Thanks everybody for coming out, both in person and on Zoom. Very happy to be hosting this roundtable on the birth and death of dictatorships. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. This is the first roundtable of the sort we've had this year. We often try to combine these with book conferences. We're having a book conference tomorrow for Adam Casey, who'll be presenting today, and so it's great to have our guests come out both to help with that and then to also present some of their work to the assembled group. So let me just briefly introduce everybody before I turn things over to our presenters. So immediately to my left, Adam Casey is WCED postdoctoral fellow for 2021 to 2023. His research broadly considers the relationship between dictators and their armed forces. He's currently working on 2 book manuscripts. The first considers the relationship between foreign support and authoritarian rule. That's what we'll be doing the book workshop on tomorrow. And his second book project, which he's doing with Lucan and myself and Jean LaChapelle at University of Montreal, considers the origins of military political power in the post-colonial world. Adam received his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto in 2020. Bruin is an associate professor of government at Hamilton College. Her research focuses on civil-military relations, civil war, and policing. She's the author of How to Prevent Coup d'etat, Counterbalancing Regime Survival, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. At Hamilton, Dr. De Bruin directs the program on justice and security at the Arthur Levitt Public Affairs Center. She received her PhD from Yale University in 2014. Megan Stewart is an associate professor of public policy at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Welcome, Megan. Hooray. Her research interests focus on explaining variation in how changes to social, economic, and political hierarchies are attempted and achieved, and how war or political violence is often the context or consequence of such endeavors. Stewart is the author of Governing for Revolution, Social Transformation and Civil War, which is Cambridge University Press 2021, in which she explains why some rebel groups undertake complex and challenging wartime projects to transform social orders by altering hierarchies of power, while most other rebel groups do not. And last but not least, Lucan A is professor of political science at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on global patterns of democracy and dictatorship. His most recent book, now out with Princeton University Press with Steve Levitsky, is Revolution and Dictatorship, The Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism, which provides a comparative historical explanation for the extraordinary durability of autocracies born of violent social revolution. Way's solo authored book, Pluralism by Default, Weak Autocrats and the Rise of Competitive Politics, with Johns Hopkins in 2015, examines the sources of political competition in the former Soviet Union. So we got an amazing group of folks, a really interesting set of questions that all of us think about in a variety of different ways. And so everyone will present for as long as they present, and then we will turn it over to for questions. We have a really nice sized crowd on Zoom as well. So this is great. Thanks all for coming. And Adam, let's start off with you.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks so much for our panelists for being here today, as well as for my book workshop tomorrow. So all of us are reflecting a little bit on how our own work touches on how the manner in which autocratic regimes emerge shapes their consolidation, collapse, and what comes after dictatorship. What do we gain by focusing on the origins of authoritarian regimes, and what are the limitations by looking at regime origin? And so there are kind of 2 principal ways in which my work examines the relationship between where autocratic regimes come from and how they are consolidated and collapse. So first, I look at how in this book project that we are meeting with to discuss tomorrow, how foreign powers sometimes create, consolidate, and subsequently support authoritarian regimes in the post-colonial world. And secondly, how the sort of nature of military organization, and more specifically where militaries actually come from, shapes the durability and nature of authoritarian rule. So first of all, I'll speak a little bit about each one in turn. So foreign support. So some authoritarian regimes are actually directly created by a foreign power. This is not as uncommon as it might seem. Now, some of these are colonial governments the indigenous colonial elite who holds positions of power, sort of late semi-autonomous colonial regimes, inherits the post-colonial state. Actually, in some work I've done with Lucan, around 2/3 of cases of decolonization actually give power to elites who held office under late colonialism. So in these cases, regimes emerged, inheriting state and party structures that were actually created by colonial powers. And secondly, some regimes were actually imposed by sort of force of arms or foreign intervention. So when we think about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, both the Soviet Union and the United States and the Korean Peninsula, some regimes are directly created by foreign. In other cases, foreign support comes later, comes after a regime's already emerged through the provision of aid, arms, and advisors are provided to a government that is already in office. And so I think that I find in my work that one of the most important factors in explaining sort of how the ways in which regimes come about shapes their sort of subsequent trajectory is the role foreign actors play or do not play in organizing the state security apparatus. So very profoundly different militaries emerged out of different types of foreign intervention. So the United States pursued a model of military building in countries we intervened in that looked very different from the model of military building the Soviet Union engaged in. So in the United States, the United States was actually a relatively minimal player in sort of overseas colonialism with some notable exceptions like the Philippines and obviously internal colonialism of indigenous groups. But in terms of overseas colonialism, the United States actually engaged in relatively little compared to other European powers. But we did engage in a bunch of imperial interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, where we created sort of new security institutions from scratch. And here we built armies kind of in our own image, but in foreign countries. And what I mean by in our own image is I mean institutionally fairly autonomous, supposedly nonpartisan and apolitical, and extremely centralized. And that left a kind of ironic and not always in the way intended for the United States. Once we left, these military institutions ended up being potent problems for the post-intervention political elites. So in just one example, the Dominican Republic, we created a new military relatively early in the 20th century. We were worried about the politicization of the force, so we said that all promotion decisions must be in the hands of the guard commander. The guard commander ended up being a man by the name of Trujillo, who used that position as a really powerful counterweight against the Dominican political elites and would end up dominating Dominican political life for decades after the US intervention. Now, the Soviet Union also built a lot of militaries in the developing world, but it did it really differently than the United States. The Soviet Union built armies that also mirrored its own domestic civil military relations and political structure. And these were those partisan armies. Here, the Soviet Union devoted considerable efforts to subordinating these militaries to parties it also created. Now, what does it mean to subordinate a military to a party? There are essentially kind of three institutional features of partisan militaries. One is that the party controls promotions within the army, so when an officer goes up for promotion. The second is that military officers are monitored by party political officers. In the Soviet Union, these were called commissars. And the third is that the Soviet model involved directly embedding military counterintelligence agents in the military to spy on the regular professional officers. Now, this military, created by and inherited from the Soviet Union, had profoundly different relationship to post-intervention political elites. These militaries were extremely constrained and unable to launch coup d'etat, which is the most common way that autocratic regimes launch. So all of this kind of above story of how foreign powers create and then create militaries and how they sort of shape post-intervention political trajectories is part of a larger story about where militaries come from. And so Dan and Lucan and I and John LaChapelle are working on a really ambitious project to sort of identify the origins of all militaries in the world since 1945, and sort of how they were created by whom and what their overall sort of organizational institutional structure was. And we think that this is profoundly important in understanding political dynamics after the creation of militaries. So, we identify empirically that there are really four ways that militaries have been created in the 20th century. Some are inherited, as I mentioned, from colonial powers. Others are imposed by the Soviet Union or the United States. Others emerge after successful armed rebellion. And others are created by, sort of indigenous existing political elites like the Siamese monarchy in the late 19th century. But what really matters is if you do not create a military, it becomes really difficult for political elites to subsequently rein that military in. So just to take one really useful illustrative case of Ghana. So Ghana had a pretty similar military organization to most of colonial Africa. It was created by, in this case, the colonial power of the British over sort of gradually in the early 20th century. And its officer corps was led all by white British officers. It was recruited mostly among northern ethnic groups who were seen as potentially more loyal to the colonial state. And so upon independence, this was actually a massive problem for Nkrumah and the other politicians who inherited the Ghanaian state. This was because the army was not their creature. It wasn't something they had created. It was staffed with individuals with very few social links to post-colonial elite. And institutionally, it was very separate from the sort of political apparatus that inherited the state. And so Nkrumah did the things we might imagine an autocrat nervous about the loyalty of their army did. He started interfering in promotions. He created a large counterweight to the army and expanding his presidential guard. He created a militia. He created a new intelligence service. But all of these things were viewed correctly by the army as threats to its corporate and personal interests. And the army struck against him in the 1966 coup that overthrew. So Nkrumah came to power with a series of strengths. He was popular. He had actually a fairly large civilian party, but he inherited an army he did not create. And this proved to be ultimately an insurmountable obstacle for consolidating an authoritarian regime in Ghana, and a story that we actually find is relatively common. And that's sort of that's the main focus of this larger project. So, and with that.
Great, thanks, Adam. Erica, next.
Great, thanks so much. So most of the work that I've done as it relates to this panel has focused on coups d'état, or illegal overt efforts to try and remove an executive from power. And so what I thought I'd talk about was how knowing that a regime originated in a coup, what that can tell us about the sort of trajectory of that regime. As Adam mentioned, coups are very commonly in dictatorships are both born and die. And I think that coup-installed regimes face a particular set of threats and challenges that makes them a little bit distinct from other types of regimes. I'm going to focus on two in particular in my remarks. First, when a leader comes to power in a coup, they tend to inherit existing state institutions mostly intact. This can happen in other contexts, particularly contexts of colonization, but coups are particularly short-lived. Most of them are over in a matter of hours, if not days. And so the newly installed regime really has not had a chance to change much within the sort of existing institutions. And this means that the newly installed leaders are dealing with often loyalists of the previous leader, which may present a threat to their rule. At the same time, leaders that come to power in a coup are often hyper aware of the threat of a coup from other places, right? So they're coming to power with the backing of the military. And one thing that we've seen is that coups engender more coups, right? So they can have this effect of legitimating military politics, or even just demonstrating that it's possible to seize power. So I think there's a kind of heightened sense that among leaders that come to power in a coup, that the military is going to be a big threat for them. At the same time, there's a window of opportunity that gets created in the aftermath of a successful coup. Work by other scholars of military relations and myself has found that one thing that can happen in the aftermath of a successful coup is that there's sort of a clarification of the balance of power between different factions. And so you often see coup leaders try and take advantage of this window of opportunity to try and reduce the ability of the military to seize power in a future moment. So this is kind of operating in this context in which they're very concerned about a coup. There's a temporary window of opportunity to try and institute a whole series of coup-proofing tactics. And so we know that leaders that come to power in a coup often engage in purges of the existing military and internal security forces. They may be ethnically stacking those forces. And I found in some cases in my own work that they are able to, in that moment, create new counterweights to the military. However, coming to power in a coup, I think, doesn't guarantee that leaders are going to take advantage of this window of opportunity, or if they do try to coup-proof, it doesn't tell you exactly how they're going to do it. And one, I think, exception to this, or one type of regime that comes to power in a coup that doesn't do a good job, or usually of taking advantage of this, is military regimes. And so some coups don't result in military regimes. They install some sort of civilian leader, and someone becomes a personalist dictator. But others are staged by the military as an institution. And where a coup results in a rule by the military as an institution, often the military doesn't want competitors to its power. And so coup-installed leaders that come to power in a coup that tend to represent the military as an institution will often try to abolish existing counterweights to the military in the form of a sort of independent police or gendarmerie force, militia, presidential guard. They'll try to bring those under military control or abolish them, right? They're seen as competitors to the military. But in doing so, these regimes can be sowing the seeds of their own destruction, right? One thing that I found in my own work is that leaders that have counterbalanced the military with other security forces tend to not necessarily deter coup attempts, but be more likely to survive those coup attempts that do occur, right? And so bringing these other forces under the military can end up resulting in a situation in which coup attempts are more likely to succeed. Okay, so the second thing that I think is different about regimes that come to power in a coup is that these regimes face what Ronald and Weiser have called the dual legitimation challenge. And this means they need to justify not just why they should rule as opposed to other people, but also how they came to power. And this is in contrast often to both leaders in democratic states and other types of dictatorships. So democratic leaders obviously point to elections and sort of rule of law, the process by which they became in charge of the country. But some other forms of in other forms of dictatorship, there may be an easier way to legitimize the regime. So monarchs can refer to their hereditary right to rule or divine right. Leaders of revolutions or rebellions can make the claim that they have broad popular support or that they've just won this military victory that's brought them to power. Coup leaders typically don't have that. Coups are often staged with a very small number of participants. They're kept secret until they're staged for the most part. So the number of people that are usually participating in the coup is very small, and it's much harder to make this kind of broader claim for legitimacy. So the second sort of challenge that coup leaders face is that they can face a lot of popular challenges to their rule that I think may be more salient than in other types of dictatorships. Of course, people that come to power in a coup may try to legitimize their rule in a bunch of ways. Often the military is very popular, maybe a state institution that is more popular than other types of state institutions, definitely more popular than the police, and often more popular than civilian leaders. The military often has claimed to being a sort of defender of the nation, or they performed well in some sort of prior military engagements. They can point to the failings of the existing regime, or they can even try to convince you that it's not a coup, right? So we often have coup installed leaders tell you that this was popular will, this was not a coup, they're just doing what the population wants. And increasingly, coup installed leaders try to use elections to legitimate their rule. And we know that that tactic in particular can be pretty effective. So some research by Bruin has found that coup leaders or coup-born regimes that hold elections are much more durable than coup-born regimes that don't hold elections. And that seems to be increasingly true in the past couple of decades. So they last on average 7 years when they hold elections, and those that don't last more like 2 years. So I think overall, sort of knowing that a regime has come to power in a coup can shed light on the types of challenges that those leaders face, but not necessarily if they're going to be able to meet those challenges. And there's still a lot of capacity or little opportunity for those leaders to make different decisions about what they're going to do to help prop up their rule. I think there's, I think in general, some limits in a focus on, if you're trying to explain how dictatorships die, only focusing on the coup origin or not coup origin doesn't tell you a ton beyond, I think, those kind of initial challenges. Knowing that a regime came to power in a coup does not tell us how radical a break its policies are going to be from the past, or the extent to which even its leaders want to rule, right? Some military officers kind of come grudgingly to this and don't want to be there. Some actually do want the military to rule as an institution or want to personally rule. So I think that there's a lot that then happens after that initial moment. The last thing I'll say is just that this method of starting a dictatorship has been on the decline in the past several decades. The sort of heyday of coup attempts that we saw was during the Cold War in the 1970s, particularly 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they've kind of been falling off. Coup legitimation is much harder for Cold War circumstances. There's a lot more pressure for things like elections to be legitimizing them. But I will say that we're kind of in a broader global wave of democratic backsliding and autocratization, and we've started to see a kind of uptick again in the number of coup attempts that have occurred. And I think that these things are linked, right? Like I think that in the context of executives trying to overstay term limits or individual leaders trying to centralize political power, people are more willing to turn to the military or be tolerant of military coups, or to be willing to say that they're not coups, right, when they're staged. And so I expect that we're going to continue to have coup-born autocracies, even if they're not as common today as they were in the past. That'll end it up to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a bit of a, so my research is really on civil wars and rebel organizations. So oftentimes the aftermath of the dictatorship breaking down or the creation of a new dictatorship. So that said, I was really pleased with Adam's kind of questions, which prompted me to think about some of the links between my work on the processes during civil wars and the implications for after. So just to kind of situate you in how I'm thinking, my research is on how rebel groups craft governance institutions during war itself. So if we think back it seems like ages ago, but just to 2014, 2015 with the Islamic State, you might remember that the Islamic State was capturing territories in Iraq and Syria, reforming them, revising them. There were so many articles that came out of the New York Times around this period about how the Islamic State was really changing social, economic, and political processes in the territories. This was then followed up by the Kurds of Syria and Rhodesia, but also introducing their own political institutions at the time. So that's sort of the basis of my research, is focusing on how rebel organizations create wartime institutions. And so one of the institutions that rebel organizations create are democratic elections in the areas that they control. So, and actually, one of the primary perpetrators of democratic elections during civil war locally were communist rebel groups. In particular, the Chinese Communist Party, as a rebel organization, held elections a couple of times in the territories they controlled before or during the Civil War. So this is in the early mid-1930s. The Chinese Communist Party, the rebel group, is holding elections in territories it controls during the war. So although these were not the elections that we would expect to have today in the United States, they were still electoral contests. The candidates had to be approved by the CCP, of course, but people voted, people participated, and participation was actually relatively high. The positions that they held, that the candidates held, if elected, actually had some degree of power, right? They couldn't set policies, but they could shape how the policies were implemented on the ground. So even though these roles were not as powerful as some of our legislatures in the US today, they still meaningfully shaped the lives of people living around them. This wasn't just China that this occurred. The pattern was repeated elsewhere around the world. So in Guinea-Bissau, one of the leading decolonization rebel movement, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, actually held nationwide elections. They used these nationwide elections as sort of a cudgel against Portugal, their imperial overlords, saying, hey, we've held elections, you haven't held elections in decades. We're the true democratic sort of society here. And then similarly in Eritrea, which is a rebel group that I study quite intensively, they similarly created wartime institutions based not only on geography, but on class. So representation was based off of class position, with poor peasants receiving more representation relative to others. So why does all this matter? In the post-war period, all three of these rebel organizations were victorious. And despite their electoral processes during war itself, they introduced some of the most enduring and robust dictatorships after war itself. So why do I think that this kind of pattern is interesting? And I think it sort of speaks to a question of like, why study the origins of dictatorships and autocrats? And I think it's good to know where we might see individuals or states heading down that path. We know internationally, being a democracy has major implications for how you engage in the international system. But if you're in a democracy, potential warning signs about how the country might be headed, I think are fairly important. So what does my story about rebel groups kind of suggest? And for me, I think it's that democratic actions at one point in your life doesn't necessarily mean a democratic future. That democracy is something to be maintained. And especially when political violence is at play, this is something the fragility of democratic institutions should be at the forefront of people's minds. Before this, the election is on my mind. I'm coming from DC, so we didn't have a voting representation in Congress. Now we have a swing state. I mean, I live in a swing state, so I'm getting political ads all the time. And so it's really on the forefront of my mind. But another Michigan professor, Ron suggests that the US only became a democracy in some places into the 1970s. So simply because democratic processes are here doesn't mean that they'll last forever and doesn't mean that they've been around for all time. So I think to me, what this work highlights, the origins of dictatorship highlight, is that some of these dictatorial origins actually have some trappings of democratic participation. And so that democratic participation has to be kind of practiced. It's not guaranteed forever. And then the second thing that I'll flag is how political violence often is used or funneled to erode or kind of negate or reduce the degree and extent of sort of power of democratic institutions. So in the rebel groups that I've studied, the democratic institutions after war often became tools of surveillance and identifying people who go along with the regime. So this is recent work by Shelby Liu, who's pointing out how rebel organizations kind of screen for people who will just say yes to what they want to do in the aftermath. So I think there's also an idea here about kind of commitment to democracy, not only sort of practicing it, but being committed to it over time. And so I think that I'm gonna leave it there, but that even though my work is a little bit more on civil wars and rebel organizations, I still think it speaks not only to this question about the origins of dictatorships, but also has really important implications for how the world we live in today.
Great. First of all, thank you so much, Adam. I've known you for a long time, and Dan. I think you were in diapers together. We were just talking about how, kind of Dan and I knew Dan when he was in grad school in the early 2000s, and we were kind of early. I'm proud to say, kind of early in the vanguard of the authoritarian studies. Others went on, did a much better job, or whatever. At least we were first. We were in the vanguard. I suspect this topic was chosen for me. So I just finished a book, as Dan mentioned, the Revolution and Dictatorship, about regime origins. And Steve Levitsky and I looked at autocracies born of social revolutions. These are basically revolutions in which power, masses bring new groups of people to power. But in contrast to your standard sort of Arab Spring, Orange Revolution, the new government both destroys the state and engages in serious social transformation, creates Sharia law, eliminates private property and the like. There aren't that many of them, about 20 we counted since 1900. Adam also responsible for counting them. We searched, scraped the barrel everywhere, found 20. And thanks to Mark Weiser, it turned out Finland was our 20th. That was a last minute addition. Finland in 1918. I'll be impressed if anybody's heard of Finland in 1880. No? Okay. You okay? Yeah. What's your name? Great. Okay. Anyways, so Finland aside, this is definitely a counterexample because it lasted about 52 days. As a whole, autocracies born of social revolution were incredibly durable. On average, they last about 3 times the average of non-revolutionary regimes. And John Leschfeld's a co-author. We went through, did all the stats, everything, all the controls, still holds up. But it's also that they survive not just much longer, but they have states like Soviet Union, China, Cuba. They survive massive policy failures, famines, economic disasters, invasion. And the like. And so these are really hard nut cases. I mean, really extreme. And I would say, probably the most durable autocracies, ever since the rise of mass politics and sort of modern authoritarians. So the question is, well, what makes them? What's the sort of secret sauce? And we have a kind of larger argument, but I want to focus on one part of the argument, which kind of ties very much into Dan's work, which is that these regimes create a profound perception of existential threat. And I really think existential threat perception, the autocracy facing an existential threat, is just, it's certainly not the only source of durability, but a hugely important one that both describes our cases, but goes beyond revolutionary cases. So for our cases, the story is, these revolutionary dreamers come to power, like Lenin in 1917. When they come to power, they're incredible. They ultimately create these durable regimes. But what we forget is that when they came to power, they were insanely weak and divided. So Khomeini comes to power, a loose coalition. Lenin comes to power in 1917 in Petrograd, barely controls a few couches in a girls' school, right? So you might think, well, what's the rational thing to do when you're weak? The rational thing to do, and most dictators do this. Nkrumah certainly did this in Ghana, that Adam talked about. You try to make as many alliances as you can, right? You try to sort of, buy support, so build as big coalition as possible. Well, the revolutionaries like Mao, like Lenin, like Castro, like Khomeini, they do exactly the opposite. They go to the world and say a big, you got it. And which in the short term is quite irrational. But in the long term, what this ends up doing in most of the cases, and there are a few cases where it fails, like in Hungary in 1919, like in Cambodia in 1975 with the Khmer Rouge, and the like. But in most of our cases, in all these cases, it creates a sort of counter-revolutionary conflict, right? You say to the world, and you say call for the end of capitalism. Capitalism is not just going to sit back and say, okay, destroy me, I don't care. And they fight back. And you have counter-revolutionary wars in 17 of the 20 cases of our cases in serious conflict. And this conflict in turn generates this intense existential threat of survival of the regime that you don't see in a lot of autocracies. And this existential threat does two things. First, it dramatically raises the cost of defection because this is a life or death struggle. So in Russia in the early 20s, there was conflict between Stalin and Trotsky. There probably you could not find in history two people who hated each other more than Stalin and Trotsky. And furthermore, Trotsky had barely been a Bolshevik. You remember the party just joined in 1917. This nobody named this gray blur, as Trotsky calls him, Stalin wins the battle, completely out of nowhere, or largely out of nowhere. But Trotsky remains loyal to the party, and in part that was because the general consensus was if there was any split in the Bolshevik party, the revolution was over and the counter-revolution would seize the day. And so this sense of existential threat in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, Cuba, Iran, Mozambique, and elsewhere, this fear of annihilation amid civil war generates a powerful and often enduring incentives to close ranks. That's the first thing. The second thing is cohesion. Second thing is it encourages institution building. Again, with Russia, Lenin comes to power without a state. They even have an ideology which says that after a communist revolution, you won't have a state. Well, lo and behold, they face this counter-revolutionary threat. Maybe we'll just create a little KGB. Nothing, we'll see what happens with that. So they create the Chekad and becomes the most powerful police force in modern history. Similarly, in similar story, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in Eritrea, they come to power, and then she can correct me, but I love Eritrea. And she's right. Anyways, so you see this pattern again and again. Both it creates this existential threat, encourages the building of strong armies. It also encourages intense cohesion. It also, this thing about this sense of existential threat, it doesn't last forever. And because eventually, these regimes become kind of a victim of their own success. They come to power, and people stop thinking about the survival of the Soviet Union. So it kind of explains how they become weak over time. So the Soviet Union, I'm thinking about Gorbachev, just died. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Well, part of the reason was that Gorbachev, like others, just assumed the Soviet Union would last forever. Because no one could even imagine. In the 20s, they thought that the Soviet Union was constantly about to be overthrown and be killed. And by the 1980s, they just assumed it would last forever. So Gorbachev does, he literally goes and chops apart his own party, destroys the Communist Party because he couldn't even imagine that the Communist Party would collapse, right? And so that was, this complacency about regime survival is what kind of allowed perestroika and glasnost to take place in the first, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So both existential threats, explains the durability and the demise of a lot of these revolutionary regimes. I also think this argument, existential threat, goes way beyond revolutionary regimes. Dan's work from 2010 about protection pacts, where you have in places like Malaysia, Singapore, and elsewhere, you have radical insurgencies encourage counter-revolutionary elites to close ranks that serves as a durable foundation for authoritarian rule. Existential threat is also important in Syria, ethnic, existential threat, the Alawites, right? The sense that it allowed sort of Assad to kind of create a sort of highly cohesive military and security services. And also, my favorite case, Togo. So you may know, people have heard of Togo, but do you know why? Do you realize that Togo has been one of the most durable autocracies in recent history? I bet you didn't know that, or you know that. But you know everything. And a lot of it has to do with the fact of that the regime is founded in this minority ethnicity, the caveat, and this sort of access. They come to power in the early 60s at Edema on the basis of this ethnic power. They're like the Alawites, kind of in the minority and constant and terrified that if they lose power, they'll face retribution. And that, as a result, the military is cohesive in the face of mass mobilization in the early 1990s. Finally, I think it explains the counterexamples with Adam's book, right? A lot of these client regimes, one of the things that Adam shows in this wonderful book is that having a client like the United States killing off your opposition communists sort of makes there's a wonderful quote from Ronald that he's sitting in power, he's very weak. Nixon's bombing the crap out of Cambodia, and someone says, well, why don't we build a strong military? He says, well, come on, the Americans are killing, we have nothing to worry about, right? So why not? You can just do whatever you want. So as a result, it discourages putting investment in institutions. So that's institutional. Second, this sort of lack of generates a lack of cohesion. And a great example here is Zambia, founded, which did not come out of violent struggle. It was the United International Independence Party. UNIP was founded, came to power in 1964. UNIP is an incredibly flabby party, very weak. There are constant sort of defections, and when the Konda calls elections, basically his entire party, because the economy is not doing that great, but whatever. And so the entire party defects to large sections of the party defecting to the opposition party, the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD, and they have this great quote which I use, basically every talk. It says, "Only a stupid fly follows the dead body to the grave." That's sort of, and so so you imagine the party is sort of this like corpse with all these flies sort of eating off. They're very, gruesome, but I think evocative. Anyway, so that's sort of so it's existential threat or its opposite. It's very important in terms of understanding the survival of dictatorships. I also think, finally I'll end with this, because I think this is the first talk I've given where I haven't mentioned Ukraine. So I have to mention Ukraine because I'm co-director of the Dictatorships program for the study of Ukraine. Anyways, if you look at Putin and other autocrats, a major effort of their survival is to kind of create enemies, right? So good dictators try to create enemies. Callahan has this wonderful book on Burma called Making Enemies. I mean, that is a major in terms of strategy and pretty decent strategy. Problems is not always plausible. So certainly Putin has tried to sort of make NATO and the like as a kind of enemy to sort of rally the public, and the like. So it's not just sort of basing his support on economic success, which is not a lot of in Russia today. But so I think it's again sort of worth looking at existential threat as an important source of durability in autocracies. Thank you.
Sure. Well, let's give a round of applause to everybody for these presentations. One quick observation before we open up so you can formulate your questions here. But one thing that strikes me is, so when we think about how the origins of a regime shape its long-term prospects, we often think about kind of the events through which the regime comes about. So a coup regime or a civil war regime or a social revolution or decolonization. But so much of what really matters, it seems, is not just this event itself, but the things that tend to precede it or the things that tend to follow it in its train. So Lucan's story about social revolutions, right? It's the fact that it generates this ongoing sense of existential threat. So how dictatorships stay alive is with this sense of existential threat and tends to come from the social revolution, right? And Megan's story on elections preceding, like, so the way that the use of elections before victory and during the Civil War, and how that then leads to surprisingly durable authoritarian regimes. And so it's not what comes in its train as much as what comes before, right? And in these stories of with the coup regimes, right, and also with decolonization, these inherited institutions, right? So when the dictatorship is born, there are things that are already in place that were created beforehand that get inherited, which then shape the regime in long and lasting ways. So I think what it kind of points to is the need to have a really rich historical understanding of authoritarian regimes, not and taking origins very seriously, but not simply as a moment or simply as a single event, but to think about the ways in which those origins imply certain antecedent factors and imply certain processes that are arising out of those origins, which in some pretty systematic, really interesting ways. And these presentations really speak to each other, I think, that we can kind of take a historical look at the regimes that we're interested in to have a better sense of their likely fates over time. So really great presentations. Does anybody want to have the first word? That's the first question. Anyone in those of you who paid the highest price and actually showed up in person and came and want to have any questions off of that? Or anyone want to? Yeah, in the very back. Right, no, in the back. Go ahead. Ma'am, go ahead, please. No, I'm calling on you in the back. Please,
No,
go ahead.
okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. My name is Anna Peronenko from Ukraine, and I'm a no, I'm Slava. So my question, I'm researching international security and particular media literacy and disinformation, fighting disinformation. And my question is, what's your take on usage of information as warfare in rise of dictatorships? If you can see any patterns, trends, maybe differences or similarities, or maybe some evolution of information as warfare, disinformation, and how it strengthens or weakens regime. Thank you very much.
Please.
So it's interesting about that because I think, obviously those who studied Russia, that was a huge focus of a lot of work. And there's a wonderful book by Guriev and Treisman, Spin Dictators, which really focuses on that. I highly recommend the book. At the same time, I do think that it's a little bit overblown in terms of, because I think basically Putin was able to rely, and this is where the book came out of, was a study of Putin on sort of the point of Guriev and Treisman is that dictators today don't have to rely on old-fashioned repression and cracking down and dragging people to jail. They can just manipulate the information environment and discredit the opposition. And certainly that works in some cases. But what we've discovered is that that's pretty easy to do when dictators use that a lot when things are going pretty good, right? Overall, when they're otherwise quite stable. But the minute things go a little bit south, that's at a certain point, if the economy is in the cracker, no amount of the economy is actually it's going to help. And so ultimately, I think ultimately old-fashioned, authoritarian iron fist is ultimately, I think, going to be seen as much more important than the sort of information manipulation.
Yeah, Eric, please.
Thanks so much. I just want to add something that I think is really specific to the dynamics of coups related to information, which is just that because coups are secret, they happen very quickly, they depend a lot on the manipulation of information, and ideally leaders within the military, they're trying to stage a coup, or civilians, they're trying to foment coups. They don't want an all-out sort of civil war, and to try and prevent that, the goal is to try and convince people that might resist the takeover that it's already succeeded. There's a great book by Ronald saying that's all about, it's called Seizing Power. It's all about the sort of dynamics. And so that's a really limited, I guess, moment in which I think this information and disinformation matters a lot. And one thing that we've seen is that It used to be much easier to sort of control the flow of information in a certain time period. And so there would be, coup plotters would be speaking over internal military channels, or they would get on television and sort of broadcast what's happening. And today, we just have much more sort of fragmentation of information sources, and ousted dictators or ousted leaders like making their own appeals on Facebook or through their preferred media channels. And so it's a lot harder to kind of have that manipulation in that specific moment of formation. And so you can get more, you can organize popular protests. And so I think that the way that I've seen it in relation to my own work has been really about this kind of complicating the sort of initial seizure of power that might start a dictatorship.
Can I just add to that quickly? I think so. Second, everything Eric said, and also what Lucan said. And I think the 2016 failed coup in Turkey led to a lot of people saying like, hey, maybe coups are always going to fail now because like FaceTime, we can sort of like Erdogan FaceTime with supporters and people came out to the streets. But then, recent coups have, they successfully seized power and there's been a lot of protests and the army has stayed. So I think, absolutely, it's like we're not seizing radio towers anymore, like that often, they still are something. But yes, it isn't probably like a panacea either. I think on the one hand, yes, it's changed the thing.
Well, there's this whole, it's a horrible term, people talk about these coup-volutions, right? It's this idea like coup that then are then accompanied with mass mobilization. So that what you might then see, that might probably explain why you see more of that, because the idea is to actually try to galvanize support. And the initial example of that was actually 1986 in the Philippines, in which you didn't need FaceTime, you had a radio. And you had to see an archbishop on the radio saying, come out and support the soldiers. And that was, so there's nothing new under the sun or something like that. Okay, you want to go? That's your question.
Yeah, so I have a couple of coup projects, so this is a great workshop for me. And one of them deals with African coups, since the AU announced its sort of anti-coup norm policy. And one of the things that's interesting about this is coups still happen. There have been about 20 since that happened, but on this project, the lead person actually is an AU negotiator. And what he says, what happens is actually the military retires from power usually quite quickly. And there's a bargain made with the African Union whereby preceding president is out permanently, military leaves relatively quickly, but military cannot stay in power. So the militaries can't be elected to president. And you have this relatively quick return to the status quo ante. No one gets sanctioned, no one's killed. It's relatively peaceful. And that's what at least we're kind of calling the new style coup, where it's much more targeted, where they're in and they're out and they have much more limited objectives. Typically not long-term power is no longer a typical objective, at least in these African ones. So I was just kind of curious because a lot of the coup literature doesn't talk much about the international context or, the Americas or in Africa, where you have these kind of international systems that are quite important for understanding coups.
I guess, actually, I'm just kind of build on that then. So the fundamental, the big fact we always hear about coups in the Cold War is they become rarer, right? But maybe speak a little bit of how they become different as well, and not only rarer. Might be kind of a more general question for all of us. Yeah, but Erica, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, this is super interesting. And I think that it's, looking at sort of the record of the AU is actually pretty impressive. They're pretty consistent about immediately sanctioning.
And so they sanction almost always.
Exactly. Yeah. This is, I was surprised because I think that I had this perception of that the international community wasn't doing much, right, in response to coups, or that the responses are inconsistent. I think there are some inconsistencies, and they don't always ban participants in coups from running for election. There's a little bit less consistency about that part of it. But including the high profile example is Egypt, right? That to run for elections. But it is a really impressive, I think, a track record, and the OAS has also done well. And I think that what that ends up doing, right, is lowering the sort of payoff to a coup, right? If you're a military officer thinking about what it is you're going to gain from this. And on the one hand, you don't get to stay in power, but on the other hand, it's also maybe not as risky, right, to be doing this, because if you have a kind of sense that you're going to be able to just go back to the military, this is a temporary takeover, maybe people aren't going to punish you as much. And so I feel like the sort of long run implications of this are a little bit less clear to me. And I think a lot of people attribute the decline in coups over time to a sort of strengthening of an anti-coup norm internationally. And I'm a little bit more skeptical about this. I'm very curious what other people on this panel think. In part just because I feel like I don't know that that norm has been internalized by members of the military themselves. They still think that they have this kind of role. And also there's still obviously for important international actors of the United States, like there's competing priorities, right? And so they're very willing to say things like, oh, that's not really a coup, or this was too much popular backing for this, and to excuse things that if it sort of fits in with other priorities. And so I always think about like John Kerry as Secretary of State, like saying there wasn't a coup in Egypt, right? Like this is, yeah, he's like, it's not a coup. And this happens all the time actually with there's track groups that speak about this. And so I don't know that this has been a long-term, I don't know that we're just like on this track to like never coups anymore. In part because I think that it's maybe a change in the sort of, we haven't seen a sort of change necessarily in or like an internalization of norms that the military shouldn't be involved in politics, only that they shouldn't rule.
Right, but if there were, let's say, a new type of coup,
Yeah.
that would produce a selection effect. Right, so you would have those who are interested in long-term power would no longer see this as a plausible scenario. So you could,
Although
you could see this as selecting a decline, not elimination, but
I would
like
say, I would say you could also learn a lesson though from Guinea or Mali, right? So like on one hand, yes, like this, absolutely, Burkina Faso, like there are a lot of examples of this kind of coup that you're talking about for sure. But I think one thing that you're noticing if you compare the 90s to today is there's a lot less, there's a split between like ECOWAS and the AU and France and the United States and how they do some of these coups. And so if you think of the kind of, Mali in 2012 versus Mali in 2020 is a very different story because the French are much more concerned about Islamist insurgents in the north in 2020 than they were in 2012. And they have that kind of split in priority. For a while in the 90s, we were all doing the same thing. ECOWAS, the AU, the Americans and the French were all like, no more military rule. And now I think, military officers are correctly noting, that there's a kind of split sometimes between, certain powerful patrons, and they're not going to be a total pariah necessarily, or they're willing to risk making it a fait accompli anyways.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to this is I think some of what's happened is that it's been sublimated into munis. And so you've sort of seen at the same time as coups have been declining in Africa, a rapid increase in munis. And I think we think of these as two totally distinct things. Like coups are more often staged by senior officers, they want to rule. Munis are about pay or benefits and their junior officers, but often the senior officers are getting junior officers to be expressing discontent in this way, and they can often achieve military priorities through munis. And so I really think that we're seeing, in addition to like the coups themselves looking a little bit different, we're also seeing some of the grievances being addressed through this kind of different form of political violence, right? Through this.
Better looking, want to add to this at all?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's really interesting because at least in research on civil wars and sort of modes of contestation, there's like the idea of sort of modular technologies being used at times and places. And it sounds like there might be kind of something of an emergence of that in coups or rechanneling certain international conditions lead to people to adopt certain technologies engaging in forms of political violence. It's interesting.
Right, and I think this question of when then the regime that's formed through coups, when it goes away, comes back to these questions of threat, right? So when the risk is relatively low, right? And this is kind of comes up in my research as well, right? Is that we see that authoritarian regimes will often democracy comes not when they're at death's door and they're going to the ground and they're being buried in the ground, to use Lucan's metaphor, but when risk seems relatively low. So keeping our eyes on kind of the risk profile, the risk perceptions of these regimes, just I think is really one thing to keep tracking, and that's rooted in the origins of the regime, but it's something that unfolds over time, and so doesn't just stay constant. So, anyone else who's here? I think that's a question to the panelists. I will go to Zoom then. If that is the case, we have a few Zoom questions. One of which is from Lucan and both now Thomas Bruce from University of Toronto. So he is making a reference to Victor Scher's new book. A lot of new books this year on this topic. So his book Coalitions of the Weak on Mao, post-Mao China, in which Victor shows that autocrats try to stack their support coalitions with inexperienced or politically compromised subordinates that they can dominate. And Scher really focuses on how the internal conflicts of a seizure group prior to forming a regime shape the trajectory of elite politics long after the revolutionary veterans have passed. So Thomas asked whether we should be focusing extensively then on the internal conflicts of seizure groups as being critical to the characteristics or the life cycle of authoritarian regimes.
I guess I've not read this.
But the sort of the argument that Victor makes is that rulers in China will tend to try to surround themselves with weaker rather than stronger figures, right? So this is why coalitions of the weak is the argument. So rather than having stronger figures around you, strengthen the position of the leader if they surround themselves with weaker figures in a network structure is sort of the idea, which is not something you'd be unfamiliar with at all.
Yeah,
It's something that we've definitely seen before.
Yeah, I know, definitely, and that, no, I mean, definitely that, I think, that was definitely reflected in Soviet history. I mean, Stalin surrounded himself with very much nobodies, and I think that's a huge, that was, kind of helps it partly, although partly explains the personalization of power, although Mao actually had around him quite strong, Zhou Enlai, who's had earlier been leader of the Communist Party. So I'm not sure it's always the case. And oddly enough, Lenin in Russia was not a personalist leader who surrounded himself with incredibly strong. So I think there's actually a lot more variation on this than it's sometimes
But certainly one thing we'd be looking at, right, again, is if you look at just what kind of figures the original autocrat surrounds himself or herself with, right? And then what are then the effects of that? Right? So this is internal, this must be something. So it's kind of the internal politics. This sounds like a good question for your alley, right?
Definitely, yeah, and we see this a little bit in civil wars in the world. We're trying to balance two tensions, which is cultivating broad popular support during the war itself, which might be necessary to overthrow the regime. But at the same time, we see rebel leaders who've amassed a lot of power. That's a point at which sort of a point of leverage where they can try and get resources or exert broader control, and can lead to actually pretty severe and significant internal struggles. So we both talked about Eritrea. There was a very famous case during this war where one rebel leader wanted to go further than actually the primary rebel leader. They were friends from actually high school. They went to college together. They knew each other very well. But because of these one of the leaders had already amassed a following, and they ended up falling out quite significantly, leading to a bit of a setback for rebels during war. So it's interesting that there's similar tensions that are happening during the wartime process that similarly emerge in the consolidation stage, and similar trade-offs that usually.
Yeah, I guess my to push back a little bit. I think that there are kind of divisions everywhere, and I think for example, people always focus on this party was so fun. Well, I mean, every large organization has factions, and I think that it's sometimes underappreciated. I think the issue is that these regimes I study, I mean, certainly most of them, across cases, there were divisions in everyone. The question is whether, it's my case, is whether it was sufficient existential threat that convinced people to sort of overcome those divisions. And I think so. The question may not just be like what the divisions are, but sort of what the stakes are that would sort of encourage people to move against, sort of to kind of solve those divisions that should be unified. And that's
right. So there's kind of these two different. It's actually reminds me of Paul Stanley's work on these networks of rebellion, right? So kind of what the social network structure is of the group that prevails, like in these civil wars, right? But so one possibility is that the difference in these authoritarian regimes is about something that was different before they prevail, right? Something about the way that they're constituted. And another possibility, as you're saying, is like, well, it's what you do with it. It's what, even with a small initial advantage, if you use it in a certain way, if you actually do smash the state, if you do actually push through social transformation, even these weak, like these ugly ducklings, right? These weaklings from the get-go could become the 1,000-pound gorilla, whatever the metaphor is, once they, and then so it's not the kind of factors which matter from before might be less essential if you overcome them in certain ways in the early days. There's a window of opportunity to use your
right. Or the opposite. So like take my favorite case, Guinea Bissau, which had a population, by the way.
That's what was your favorite case. I was wondering what happened to Guinea Bissau.
So that's a case in which it was one of the few revolutionary regimes to have a coup in 1980, and that was a coup very much on ethnic differences between Cape Verdeans and sort of mainland Guinea Bissau. And so people say that, oh, look, it's these huge ethnic, that's what's driving the fact. Well, then, but then you look at during the revolution, the independence war in the 1960s, none of these things mattered as much because you had some overriding threat. And so, if it was so important, why didn't it matter in the 1960s, or why didn't other, Mozambique, Angola, why were they able to resolve these conflicts? I mean, I guess, yeah, you have these kind of divisions literally everywhere. I mean,
So since you're talking about Eritrea, so it makes me think about Ethiopia next door, right? So thinking about, and I'm not gonna call on him, we do have an Ethiopia expert in the room. We do have Adam Pieper here, who is an expert on Ethiopia, who I might want to bring into the conversation. But you have the EPRDF, right? So there you do have by all measures be very, you would think this is a real kind of ragtag coalition of a bunch of different ethnic groups, and they have to go through this whole constitution making process and federalism and all of these things, but it winds up, at least until the last couple of years, this looks like a very, very strong, very consolidated, very centralized authoritarian regime, which so presumably because of things they're able to do after, right, that they're able to use that small initial advantage and then able to create maybe a stronger regime than we would have thought it was going to be in 1991 when they first toppled the dirt.
Well, I would never argue against Adam, but I would say also, so maybe I'm sure he agrees with all of this. But I'd say another part of that story is also that the TPLF, which was the primary mover of this coalition, dominated the security services after 1991. So,
right. But in a way that was obvious from the way the war was fought, or in the way that they then just were able to, again, become first among equals. So I guess how much are they first among equals when they prevail, as opposed to when they clearly become first among very unequals, down the road, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they absolutely, I think the EPRDF is a great example of how origins don't explain everything, insofar as they dominate it right away, but over time, these kind of organizations, they largely create for the occasion, right? Like the Oromo and Amhara kind of fronts that they create are almost kind of emerge basically out of nowhere and really have kind of no cohesion. And later on, they actually develop real institutional interest, mobilization capacity. I mean, they're kind of patronage machines, but they're still pretty powerful. And Tigrayans only make up 6% of the population. So eventually, they can't completely dominate the Ethiopian state forever.
Right. Yeah. So to what degree was Tigrayan domination of the Ethiopian state even imaginable in 1991? Right. Given the history of it. So I'm not going to call on you, Adam, but if you have thoughts, you're more than welcome to add. I would love to hear them.
So one thought is that this continues to manifest itself in the ongoing civil war, which has very much become a civil war between our regional forces and Tigray, and then also with, of course, the federal forces in Eritrea. But this notion that Amhara forces were weak and were not. Some of them might have argued that at the time of the Dirk's downfall, the major player was actually the PLF, not the TPLF. And once its secession was secured, then TPLF emerged as the main player. But this notion that Amharas were not playing a key role, it seems pretty obvious that Oromos and Southerners were not playing a key role because most of those elites were recruited from the Dirk prisoners of war to join the EPRDF. But the fact that Amharas were not playing a key role has become very offensive and a point of resentment and a point that's perhaps driving these Amhara militias further into Tigray, continuing the civil war today.
So history also doesn't write itself, right? So there's also these things can be disputed, and the roles that these different groups can play can, so the ongoing politics of who did what and how did we actually attain this victory in the first place. Right?
The other interesting thing about what you're saying is I think it's interesting how grievances that don't express themselves immediately can suddenly be triggered later on. I mean, and so what explains why does that grievance become so critical? At a certain point later on, or was that sort of? But is it kind of one hypothesis is the boiling pot hypothesis? Be up there, and it's just or is it some more contingent sort of set of circumstances that sort of leads people to frame complex?
You gotta stay latent, which again, another reason to know the history. So even if it doesn't just continue in a consistent way, that something gets re-triggered over time based on those foundational conflicts, right? This idea of political settlements, right? Some kind of political settlement comes about, and then when that settlement gets violated in some way, that becomes these triggers for new conflicts, and then either the regime can consolidate, or maybe it fall into civil war or what have you. Anybody have any responses for each other or anything want to speak to?
Yeah, I have a question for everybody. So,
Yeah.
like, we know that dictatorships are emerging in slightly different ways than before. I think I agree with Erica that the coup is not necessarily gone as a mode of regime creation. And I personally really like Megan's work in part because I think these kind of revolutionary rebel groups are probably not gone forever. And in fact, there are some relatively recent examples. And so, rebellion, I mean, the Tigrayans almost, they got within, I don't know, not that many kilometers of us, not that long ago. They almost went 2 for 2 in terms of long-term rebellions. And so, I mean, the Taliban obviously just overthrew the government. So some of these modes are not going away, but we do know that like autocracies are tending to emerge from the deconsolidation of democracies. And they're tending to do so in non-random places. And so I wonder if we could reflect on like, how does the kind of new way that autocracies emerge tell us about the kind of trajectories of currently evolving dictatorships? Are they going to be less durable than they were before? What does the kind of future of dictatorship look like in the new modes of authoritarian creation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way of looking at that, which I've been interested in, is sort of, one of the core sources of strength of autocracy. Yeah, I sort of think of the autocracy's high point as the 1970s. In many ways, that's sort of in some ways the height of the Cold War, or right around there, and I think sort of both geopolitical and global ideological polarization really kind of fed autocracies powerful because they've obviously provided a rationale, really both powerful global power allies, but also internal rationale for autocracies in a deep kind of sense of existential threat on both sides, probably anti-communist. And I think, a big reason of this, part of Gorbachev's contribution to democracy was the fact that he sort of, he eliminated kind of this sort of polarization around Marxism. And I think the sort of the weakness of polarization is actually one of these things that I think is kind of allowing democracies to survive much longer than they might otherwise, because there's sort of, but I think the question is sort of, obviously, polarization is not going away, but what are sort of the new forms of polarization that might emerge, if not about communism, anti-communism, but I mean, I think to a certain extent it was sort of Islamist movements versus non-Islamist movements, but I'm not sure that it's interesting with Islamism because at first I first thought, well, Islamism is going to be the new Marxism. It's going to like be the kind of driver of revolutionary movements, and you have the anti-Islamism, so that's going to be the sort of. But somehow I think it's for whatever reason, Islamist movements have a hard time coming to power. I mean, it's just interesting. You have Iran, you have the Taliban, and ISIS. It has. I mean, maybe it's just there aren't as many Islamic countries, but I don't know. I mean, and so it hasn't kind of formed the basis of this polarization. And then, of course, you have the geopolitical conflict with China, but you have no ideas, in my view, behind that. It's not like there's no battle of systems, right? It's just like it's one type of capitalist power against another type of capitalist power, both of which rely on the same international system. And so I think that's also been something that has again kind of allowed democracy to kind of hang on. So I guess my response would be like, I want, but new forms of polarization that emerge, but I think we need to sort of start thinking about, where that might come from. Because I think with that, not on wood, I think you don't have that. I think that would be the best case scenario, because I think that sort of gives room for democracy to survive.
Well, on the authoritarian side, I mean, there's this question of like Islamic movements, right? So kind of one question is, why did you have a bunch more Irans, after, like, you don't have a lot more? I'd say, why wasn't that the new way in which authoritarian regimes got overthrew? And I think, one reason why is because you have to think about the absorptive capacity of authoritarian regimes, right? To kind of absorb the demands of radical groups, actually bring them into their own legitimation formula. And so it seems to me in a lot of the Middle East, so, like, it's kind of interesting, monarchies kind of were falling like, they were falling all over the place in the, in the 60s and 70s, right? And then after Iran, like now suddenly people say monarchies are these really durable forms of authoritarianism, right? It's like, well, how did that happen? Well, one is like survivor bias, right? Well, they survived, but I think also part of it is, socialism, like socialist movements were very hard for monarchies to deal with, right? But Islamic movements were actually not that hard to deal with because they could absorb, Islam into the, it's like, well, we had Islam. I'm like, who's the leader of Islam in the country? Why, that's me. And so then you can kind of co-opt and bring these folks in. And so I think there's, again, something about the fundamental strengths of the regime to begin with, how much they can absorb these things. And one reason why I think, if you look around, I would say, Islamic movements have gotten a lot more of what they wanted, I would say, 20 years down the road than what they wanted 20 years ago, than say socialist movements wanted it, say, certainly in Asia, where they were just getting crushed and not getting, counter-revolutionary regimes were not moving in a socialist direction at all, and not absorbing, but sort of defeating. So,
Although you could make the same case with capitalism. And Marxism, part of the reason, Marxism was so a potent force, despite the fact that England was able to co-opt a lot of the Marxist demands. I'm not sure you can make the same.
So like Western Europe, right? So there's kind of there's the ways in which, and I'll call it like the moderation, the inclusion hypothesis, right? And this idea of the way this works in Western Europe, but it didn't really, that's not what happened in Asia, right? That's sort of the point, is that like you had these leftist movements just get really, like they either won in a few places or they lost very, very badly, but they changed politics in the process of losing in places like, again, Singapore, Malaysia, where the left was very, very strong. Indonesia, very, very strong left. They get completely annihilated, but what's left in its wake is a very different kind of system.
Right, so I think that goes to my alternative. I think that's your argument about why Islam failed, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that sort of the absorptive capacity they can sort of just co-opt and right, which clearly Saudi Arabia and a lot of other places. But the other argument is there was no equivalent to the Soviet Union as a great power. Islam is great power, and I'm sure that if there was a Soviet, Soviet Union size Islamic power, you'd see, and then and that you'd see a lot more Islamic revolutions.
Yeah, I would just.
Sorry.
No, that would be, if I were to speculate as well, that would also be it. I think at least we see with the revolutionary regimes, the transnational connections are so robust and so profound. And they're really, really college, high school, people who have, your roommates, right? Basically imagine them as revolutionary leaders down the line, literally how tight these bonds are, and they're global. So we have the leader of the PAIGC coming to the US, talking to civil rights leaders, then talking to Congress, right? So they're very profound and deep and broad. And so I think like in the absence of some state to kind of continue to build and perpetuate and invest in that, not just the Soviet Union, but others, like many hubs across the world in which actors could meet each other and share resources and find support. In the absence of like this network, it's really, really hard to build and sustain a broad set of like revolutionary.
But you're saying there wasn't this.
Correct. Yeah, there was like Iran and some other places, but like, yeah.
So why was that? We're kind of mansplaining, but I just want to say, Dan and I know nothing about it. I feel like this other like, oh my god, I'm mansplaining. So just
No, so I'm not sure. I think Iran tried with Hezbollah, like initially, and you can sort of see some places, but if you think about the place, the Soviet Union, China, Yugoslavia, then Mozambique became big, Cuba, so just lots of little hubs and pockets where people could go and meet and interact with each other and sort of like triangulate with each other in sort of interesting ways. And got Iran and now the Taliban, but the same sort of set of connections and global scope, I don't think is as present, although there's certainly connections between Islamist or jihadist organizations today, not that by far and away exists. But I think like the depth of support and expansiveness of connections is not there, although I think Ron did try. That's what
Well, I'm gonna take this in a slightly different direction. It's okay. So for me, I've been thinking a lot about this kind of shift from overt military coups to this slower moving kind of autocratization or democratic backsliding as sort of being the threat. And I think that there's two things I would say about that kind of shift and what that means for us. The first is that the military is still playing a big role in a lot of these processes, even if it's not sort of at the forefront. And so often, leaders that come to power through elections that would like to remain in power, maybe past their term limits, or like to centralize power themselves, turn themselves into dictators, they usually need the backing of the military to be willing to do this. And Kristen Harkness, who's done a whole bunch of great work on militaries in Africa in particular, has found that it's much easier for leaders to overstay their term limits when they have a co-ethnic military that is like perceived as loyal to them, right? This military is not going to intervene to sort of stop them from doing that. And so I think that even though they're not, I think that I guess that's my first point, is just that I think that it's still an important role for the military. The second thing that I think is important to think about in this transition is that in some ways it's harder to coordinate. It seems harder to coordinate against more subtle, slow processes than it is to coordinate against a coup. We know about 50% of coups succeed, and that still continues to be the case. And it might seem like those are hard to defeat because they're people with guns are showing up and sort of taking over. But they also provide this sort of focal point where you can have a big popular mobilization. If there is popular protest, there is international condemnation, there's work from international organizations or sanctioning. You can want that back in a way that sometimes it's much harder to organize against a more slow moving incremental process through which you might build an autocracy. And I think I'm going to apologize for bringing this to the US case a little bit. Probably this has been on my mind a lot. So I think that if President Trump had the military to shut Congress or like try to rerun the election, like if he actually did that, it would have been much easier to sort of coordinate a response. And instead, what we've seen is a sort of a slower, more gradual sort of chipping away, undermining electoral institutions, transgressing of norms about peaceful transfer of power, sort of delegitimization of the electoral process, and a lot of shenanigans at the sort of local and state level that it's harder to get people to pay attention to, right? It's harder to think about how to coordinate. I don't know what's going on. I know what's going on in New York State, but I'm not paying attention to other states that are not in the same way. And so in some respects, I feel like the kind of shift from more overt coups to this more subtle process, which may include self coups or just kind of legal ways in which leaders are keeping themselves in power for a long time, can be much harder to notice and sort of move people around. And so that really worries me. And one new project that I have going right now is a survey experiment that's looking at conditions under which people in the United States will tolerate democratic backsliding and more like overt actions by the executive to stay in power. And one thing that we find is that crisis situations, so physical security threats, economic crises, like those things, were also situations where people perceive that the other side is behaving unfairly. People will start to legitimate and be much more supportive of kind of actions in response to that are also undermining the democratic process. So I feel like this, on the one hand, is like good we don't have as many overt coups anymore. This is like a success story. But I'm concerned that there's this other process that we need to be on as well.
So to push back a little on that, I mean, couldn't you sort of flip that and also say, I mean, just as like the transitions literature taught us that all these problems of inequality and sort of that basically democracy could adapt to both corruption. I mean, one of the reasons why democracy survives is that it can survive these intensely corrupt places, intense inequality, because the rich can sort of do very well under democracy. So why should they they overthrow democracy if they can do? And so couldn't we say the same on the flip side, that if the military is thinking no longer has to engage in coup, it can just get what it wants out of a competitive political system, then that actually is good for democracy. You may sort of whatever you understand by quality of democracy, it may undermine governance, but it also might mean that the military can accommodate itself in a variety of regimes, and therefore democracy is going to survive longer. I mean, I guess I'm just taking yours and kind of looking at it from a more optimistic angle, because I'm a glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah, no, I think actually the military in the US is giving me reasons for optimism, right? About like I think there is some context in which militaries have internalized norms of skill and control, and they're attempting to, I'm just gonna say, right? It's really hard to build nonpartisan militaries and to actually get individual military officers to internalize the idea that it's not their place to determine who's in power. And like we've largely gotten to that place in the United States despite repeated efforts by not just President Trump, but many other administrations to try and politicize the armed forces and identify with one particular party. And like that's remained particularly durable in the United States because we don't know how to export it to other countries. And the book really shows us. But I don't want us to get into the trap, I think, of thinking that like the military will save us, because this is, I think you saw this a lot in the opposition. That people would say, well, it's a really good thing that there were like generals around Trump who were constraining him, or there were people would say that, you know, it's really good that I just get very concerned about thinking about the military as the thing that has to guarantee democracy. So I don't know how that's a good answer.
And it really fits, I mean, what Lucan was describing, you basically described Indonesia, you know, to a large extent there. The idea that if you can make, you know, if you make democracy safe, if you make democracy safe from the military, you have to make democracy safe for the military, right? It seems to be the Indonesia lesson, right? So where basically the military has remained a very powerful actor, but they can live with democracy because they basically get what they want. But on the other side, you know, you have Thailand and you have Myanmar, where I'd say in both of those cases too, civilians basically gave the military more or less everything that they wanted and needed, and they still took over. So this is sort of the problem, and some of with this kind of, you know, in the proofing literature and the like, that, you know, whether or not, you know, sharing power, giving more to the military, does that embolden them? Does that put them in a stronger position to take over? Or does it actually serve some kind of like co-optative role that lets them then live with democracy? And I think there are just so many examples where it goes both ways, that it's thorny. And the role of the military is so big in so many of these places that I think a lot of places are in more danger of something really going wrong than might.
Yeah, although still on average, if, I mean, it's the same, you know, if the democratization is always threatening to the military, just thinking Latin American transitions.
Yeah.
Versus if in some cases it's not threatening, it's going to be overall net benefit for democracy. You know, it doesn't have to be in every case.
Right.
But, you know, the fact that you can, in a lot of cases, accommodate, and Indonesia being a pretty striking case where the military obviously was, you know, quite powerful, but it's still a net benefit. So basically, I think, you know what's wrong with co-optation? You know, I'm a big fan of co-optation and democracy and all those things, because they allow institutions like democracy to survive.
It's hard to follow that, but Erica, what do you think?
Back to your idea of the existential threat, right? And so in some cases where the military has a clear role that's external, that is like focused on that, then it's like it's easier for the military to feel like it's going to be safe under a democracy, right? When the military has been internally focused, dealing with insurgency, you're dealing with whatever else, repression on behalf of the dictator, it's much harder, I think, to sort of make it possible to make the officers feel that democracy. This comes back to your work. I think existential dramatic is right. And it is a big literature on.
But it's also actually, I think what the point you're making, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, is like the ways in which this sort of, you know, slow boil quality of threats to democracy, you know, sort of, you know, it's kind of happening in this sort of hybrid way. It's hard to identify, has meant that it's been harder to respond to. And so one of the things I've argued is that one of the sort of, you know, upsides of Putin's invasion was that it was so clearly a threat in a way that to the liberal order that, you know, Orban, you know, people took 10 years for people to figure out Orban was authoritarian. It took people, you know, most people, outside of Noam Chomsky, about, you know, 2 minutes to figure that, you know, this was a threat to the liberal order, and so it has motivated. So, yeah.
One of the basic rules of social movements, contentious politics, is that nothing galvanizes a big protest like moral outrage. And so to the extent that you can basically de-democratize a place without triggering moral outrage, you know, without any one big event, then you'll tend to get less resistance for it. So there's good reason to believe that too. But Well, I think we've really enjoyed talking to each other. We obviously all get along, have a lot of talk, and I hope it's been enjoyable for everybody else as well, both on Zoom and here. Thanks again for coming out. I just want to end just by thanking, so Birth and Death of Dictatorships. Thanks, Adam Casey, Megan Stewart, Lucan A, and hope you guys will be coming to events throughout the rest of the year. So thanks so much.